In this video, I'll show you how to make this simple 2x4 workbench with the plywood top and 1x6 shelf. This workbench was inspired by Steve Ramsey and a Woodsmith magazine. This is my second YouTube video, so I would love to see a bunch of opinions in the comment section below. Please tell me what was either entertaining or boring, what you'd rather see less of or more of, what things I should improve on, or maybe even products that might help me make better videos and better projects. Please watch to the end because the editing got better as the video went along. There's also a bit of stop motion and a blooper at the end. So before I get into the workbench itself, I want to mention that I cut and nailed some plywood feet for the circular saw jig because it was rocking from a screw that wasn't driven right. Now that the feet are put in, there's no more rocking in the jig. So first, I marked up the 2x4s based on how I split them up in SketchUp. So this is how I marked up the 2x4s. I made sure to mark up the 2x4s so that there's as little waste as possible. So all of the shaded in areas, this is all waste. This is using only 8 2x4s, but I modified it a little just to use up some scrap that I had laying around. But assuming you don't have scrap, this is the best way for how I make my workbench. This is the best way to split up the 2x4s. And you'll end up buying only 8 2x4s. I drew this up in SketchUp, and if you don't know what SketchUp is, it's just a free program that you could download. And you could just draw up diagrams for like any woodworking builds. And I think it's really useful, so yeah. So I finished cutting out all the pieces, except for those 2x4s over there. So the reason I didn't cut those out is those 2x4s are going to be the supports that go under the table here. And I don't want to cut them out now and then figure out later that they don't fit properly. So what I'm going to do is, after the main frame is finished, I'm going to come back and remeasure this and put those measurements onto the 2x4s over there. And that will ensure that all of these pieces fit perfectly. And now I'm gluing up the legs. After applying glue to the pieces, I made sure to clamp them. This will ensure that the bond between both pieces of wood is strong. I used F-clamps, but really you could use any clamps you want. So the screws I'm using to assemble this workbench are these SPAX self-drilling and self-countersinking screws. The head of these screws are a special star shape, and it comes with a T20 star drive bit, and these screws are really easy to use. So in order to make sure all of the legs are spaced out the same amount and at the right amount, I placed the frame that I already built right next to the unbuilt frame, and this will make sure that both sides have the same leg spacing, so the whole bench will be square. The short beam here isn't going to be screwed on there. I have it to help set up the spacing for the two frames. When I actually screw the short beams onto the parts, they will go where you could see the end grain of the 2x4s. Now I could remove the clamps and screw in the second set of screws. So in between these short and long 2x4s, there was a gap, and I had to fill that in so that this screw would drive properly into there without having the gap. And I just cut that out with the circular saw, and I just glued it in with the Titebond wood glue. So now I have the bottom crossbeam screwed in. Now I'll screw in the top one. So I'm done with the top brace, so let's move on to the workbench top. So to mark the support, I put it between the long beams, and then I marked a little bit oversized so that I could just trim it down a little with the circular saw. As you can see, I marked it right there. And I put it on the bottom just because it's easier to mark instead of trying to put it on the top there. But they're pretty much the same distance, and that's also why I trim it a little oversized so that I could just trim it back later and get it to fit perfectly. So the way I'm trimming the 2x4s is just by scooting the front edge over so that it's just a little bit on the cut line, and then I just keep bringing the saw forward and just keep trimming it down until it's the right size. So all of the workbench top supports are in place now. So the next thing I'm going to do is have some supports that go from here to over there. And that's just going to help with the slats that I'm going to cut. The slats I already have over there. Now I just have to cut them down and place them in. So to add the shelves, I'm just going to have some thin strips going along here. And I'm just going to put on the slats on top of those and have them free floating instead of screwing them down. I'm taking the measurements directly off of the workbench. So I just set it here, and I'm just going to mark it right here. And then I'll just cut it there a little larger than it has to be, and then I'll just trim it down. So for the thin strips that support the slats for the shelf, I'm not going to use the SPAX screws because those ones are just overkill. Plus they're way too long anyway, so they'll stick out the side, and I don't want that. So I'm just going to use normal 1 1/4 wood screws. So I was going to screw in the guide rails before I actually cut out any of the slats, but just to make sure everything is aligned right and level, I'm just going to cut out some of the slats right now, and then I'll use that as a spacer just to make sure that I get the rails screwed into the right spot. So I finally got the strips in. It was kind of hard. There was quite a bit of trial and error with the strips not being aligned and the board and the slats on top of it not being level, but I eventually got it. So when I drive the normal wood screws, I'm just going to use a normal drill. But for these ones, I use the impact driver because the extra torque was helpful for getting the screws to self-countersink. But that's unneeded when I just use the normal wood screws because I pre-drill and countersink the holes that I'm going to be drilling these into. So I'm just going to use the normal drill. I finished sanding the top and the shelves, and now it's completely finished. If I were to rebuild this workbench, I would make sure to take careful measurements and make extremely accurate cuts to prevent gaps and areas where I had to chisel away material. If you decide to build this workbench, or any workbench for that matter, Make sure that all the pieces that are supposed to be the same length are the same length exactly.